fresh ground, locally harvested wild venison, mixed with onions, chilies, seasonings, and a bunch of other ingredients, sculpted into a perfect meatloaf, baked and glazed with a delicious barbecue sauce. Now, I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with meatloaf. It's one of those recipes that I enjoy, but I pretty much can't eat anywhere. Or rather, anywhere besides my own house when I've made the thing. And that's because since apparently the beginning of time, it's a federal law that any meatloaf has to be absolutely riddled and smothered with ketchup. And if you know anything about me, you know that there is no more vile substance on the planet to me than ketchup. And since basically every restaurant, every relative, every person ever has put a bunch of ketchup in or on their meatloaf, I just can't eat it anywhere. So if I want it, I gotta make it myself. And there's a couple different ways to do it without ketchup. I've done it with a beef gravy as the sort of sauce, or I've used barbecue sauce, which works quite well and is really a pretty perfect parallel kind of a alternative ingredient to ketchup. So that's exactly what I'm using today to make my venison meatloaf. It's a pretty simple proposition, and if you've made meatloaf, you already know this. There's a million different ways to do it, a million different little recipes and techniques. I'll show you the ingredients I use and how I do it. We pretty much just have to mix everything together, form it into the shape of a loaf, bake it, glaze it, eat it. But since we're using some of my venison that I processed myself, the first thing we have to do is grind some of it to turn into our meatloaf meat mixture. So let's get right into it and take a look at the cut of venison that I'm going to be grinding up for this. This meatloaf calls for 2 pounds of ground meat, and it just so happens that I have this very nice top round venison roast that is almost 2 pounds. And since I will be grinding it, I'll first cut it up into some rough cubes so it will all go through the grinder nice and easy. And since this roast was not quite 2 pounds, and because I also want to get a little bit of fat content in this thing, I'll go ahead and dice up 4 thick slices of bacon to go in there as well. As always, before grinding, I'm going to put all this cubed up meat in the freezer for just a little while to get it just a bit firm so it goes through the grinder better and doesn't risk smearing any fat or meat. After somewhere between 45 minutes and an hour, the meat is ready, and I'll put the medium grind plate on the grinder and just start running the meat through. Now my ground venison and bacon is looking very nice, and I'll stick it all in the refrigerator for a bit while I get all my other ingredients ready. First, I'll chop up a yellow onion. A white onion would also work fine. I only need half a cup of chopped onion for the meatloaf, but I'm going to use the rest of this onion for another recipe I'm making today. Next, I'll mince up 3 cloves of garlic, and then chop some green onion. This ingredient is optional, but I do like to sprinkle it over top of the meatloaf slices when it's time to eat. And then I'll chop some fresh parsley, which will be going into the meatloaf. Lastly, some fresh grated Parmesan cheese, about 1/3 cup. Okay, prep work is done, and now it's time to assemble our meatloaf mixture. Starting with that ground venison and bacon, I'm adding in a 1/2 cup of panko breadcrumbs, followed by the chopped onion, and 2 tablespoons of parsley, and the minced garlic. Next, I'm throwing in one of these little cans of diced green chilies. This gives it a hit of flavor that works really well with the barbecue nature of this meatloaf, and also provides some needed moisture content. Then I'm adding 2 eggs, and the Parmesan cheese. Next, my dry seasonings. 1 teaspoon kosher salt, 1 teaspoon black pepper, and a 1/2 teaspoon dry thyme. Finally, 1/4 cup of good barbecue sauce. In this case, some of my homemade sauce that I previously canned. Now for the part that my neuroticism absolutely requires me to wear gloves for. Getting in there and mixing all the ingredients together very thoroughly. I could have also used the KitchenAid mixer for this step, but there's just so much less cleanup involved if I just use my hands. Once everything is very well mixed together, there's just one more thing I like to do before forming my meatloaf. I'll cover this bowl and refrigerate the mixture for about 1/2 an hour. This helps it get firmed up just a little bit and gives those ingredients all a chance to really meld together before this thing goes into the oven. After 30 minutes, it's time to build this loaf. And while I'm using this bread pan to form the loaf, I'm not actually going to cook the meatloaf in the pan. It will just be acting as a mold for this recipe. So I'll lay down a sheet of plastic wrap, making sure to press it down all along the inner edges, and then give it a quick spritz of cooking spray just to be safe. And now to just drop in that meat mixture, taking care to press it down and make sure it's as nice of an evenly shaped loaf as possible. As I said, I'm baking this meatloaf not in the loaf pan for 2 reasons. 1, I want the heat to reach all sides of this meatloaf so it forms a nice crust and also bakes my sauce on when we get to that step. And 2, even though the venison is quite lean, I don't like my meatloaf swimming in its own fat as it cooks, so I want to allow any excess fat to drip off. So it'll be getting baked on a baking sheet, and I like to line my baking sheet with some foil just to make cleanup way easier. Then set a wire rack on top of that baking sheet, and using that plastic wrap to help lift the formed loaf out of that pan, I'll transfer it over to the wire rack as carefully as possible, flat side down. And I ended up having to employ the old flipperoo technique here to really make sure I don't deform this big hunk of meat while getting it onto that wire rack. And now we're just about ready for the oven. The last thing I'll do is insert the probe for my real-time meat thermometer into the meatloaf. Using meat thermometers is a game changer, and with something like a big log of meat that can easily be overcooked, it's an absolute must-have. So with my oven preheated to 350 degrees Fahrenheit, I'm putting in the meatloaf. And I've got the alarm on my thermometer set to 130 degrees, which is when I will pull the meatloaf out and apply a coat of barbecue sauce to the outside. It'll take about an hour to get to this temperature. When I'm approaching 130 degrees, I'm going to get some more of that barbecue sauce heated up in a saucepan. I don't want to apply cold sauce to this meatloaf and cause its temperature to drop more than it needs to. And after that first hour, the meatloaf is looking quite nice, but still has a ways to go. Anyway, I'll give it a pretty generous brushing with that sauce all over every side, except for the bottom, of course. Then it's going back into the oven, and I'll set my thermometer alarm for the 165 degrees that we need that internal temperature to reach. About another 30 minutes, and our meatloaf is done baking and looking very delicious, but I have to let it rest for at least 10 minutes before I even think about cutting into it. But it's definitely worth the wait when I can finally cut some nice thick slices and take a look at that gorgeous interior. And as if this didn't already look good enough, there's one more thing I like to do before digging in. In a hot cast iron skillet, I'm melting some butter and searing that meatloaf slice for just a couple minutes on each side, just to crisp it up ever so slightly and also get it piping hot again after that resting period. Now it's finally ready for the plate, and there are only 2 tiny things left to do. First, drizzle with just a little more of that warm barbecue sauce. And second, garnish with a pinch of the green onion I chopped up earlier. And at long last, a bite. Tender, juicy, delicious. What's not to like about that? Now everyone knows venison is a very lean meat, which means that it is really quite easy to overcook and or dry out when cooking. That's why we pretty much had to mix in some of that pork fat in the form of bacon. And also go a little heavy on the quote wet ingredients. Those canned chilies have a lot of wetness to them. The onions, of course, the parsley, a little bit of garlic, that little bit of barbecue sauce. Honestly, I probably could have added even a little bit more of that sauce to make this thing even more moist on the inside when it's done cooking. But if you balance it out with those more wet ingredients and definitely don't overcook it, you're gonna have a pretty tender, juicy, and very tasty barbecue meatloaf. Or if you absolutely insist upon breaking my heart, I guess you could do it the same way but with ketchup. And if you do it that way, just know that I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed. Anyway, check out the video description below for a link to the full recipe that I made here today. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe to stay up to date with all our latest stuff, including future cooking and venison videos. Thanks for watching, and until next time, this is Great Lakes Prepping.